New analysis shows it's now cheaper to buy an apartment or unit than to lease one in many major Australian capital cities. PropTrack compares the forecast cost of renting a property for 10 years versus purchasing one with a 20% deposit, adding in stamp duty and rates. Business reporter Amelia Terzon joins me now. Amelia, what does this data tell us about the ongoing rental crunch, especially for apartments?
Good morning. Well, as one housing analyst said to me, it's actually a very depressing set of data out of PropTrack this morning. As you mentioned, they've forecast the cost of living in a rental for 10 years versus the cost of buying that same place outright and paying it off for 10 years. As we know, rents have been soaring across the country, especially in big cities like Melbourne and Sydney, and notably on apartments. This is with the return of migration, with people moving back from the country to big cities and all other sorts of factors that have been putting pressures on the rental market. And when you look at this, it's the reason why it's now a lot cheaper financially over 10 years to actually just buy many of these apartments in big cities like Melbourne and Sydney. I have the data here, and in Sydney, you're better off financially buying 42% of units and apartments in Sydney. In Melbourne, it's around the same sort of rate. And if you go up to places like Perth, 90% of units there, it's better off for you to buy them financially over 10 years than to rent in them. This really sorts of brings into concept to people the amounts of money that people are spending on rent at the moment. The housing market analyst that I spoke to, as I mentioned, said it's a depressing set of data because as well, if you're actually considering buying here, you'll still have to be paying exorbitant amounts of rent in order to save up the deposit to buy the apartment that you'd like to buy instead. So a difficult set of data this morning for renters who are still facing rising costs in Australia.
Amelia, as you say, essentially you're better off buying an apartment in many places than renting one, but is it possible for many?
We do know now that the deposit hurdle for many people who aren't in the housing market already is pretty much unfathomable. We know that once you pay off things like rent that is rising and all other sorts of cost of living pressures which are also rising, it's taking the average person around 14 years to save up the required 20% deposit that most banks will want you to save up for to get a property. So as a housing market analyst, Nicole Gurran says to me, she really thinks this puts into perspective how we have quite much failed to provide affordable social housing for people, especially in big cities across Australia. She says we really need to look back on the last 10 to 20 years of housing policy and figure out what has gone wrong and essentially provide more affordable housing for renters into the future.
Amelia Terzon reporting.